I'm about to give you, as much as I can, the story of how I became a timpanist in a major symphony orchestra. Well, first of all, I was born in New York City, in Harlem, what's known as Harlem, and I was born to parents who migrated to Harlem from the Caribbean, Barbados to be specific. And they came to Barbados they came to New York because my father was an artist and he thought that he would have a better life in the United States. And my mother was a pianist and she was very well respected in Barbados. So they thought, oh, go to New York. You'll make your career. You'll be wonderful. So of course they both migrated here at different times, but they met in Harlem, New York. At the time they met, my mother was a pianist and she was playing all over for all the churches. And my dad saw her and thought she was a wonderful person. He just loved her music. He said he would go wherever he thought she was playing just to listen to her music. So he introduced himself to her shyly, from what I heard, and they married. And the subsequent result of their marriage was my coming along. And of course, my mother, who had aspirations to be a concert pianist, that never materialized because they happened to come to New York, United States, at a time when racism was very much the norm. So instead of her becoming a pianist, as she had hoped, she taught piano in the neighborhood and she played in the churches, but that's about as far as she got because most of the time she had to work as a domestic worker. Because my dad, who came to the United States also to further his career as an artist, he was a linotype machine, whatever it is they do, linotypes, which of course doesn't exist anymore. but that was what he wanted to do. But when he came to the United States, they realized there was no such thing as black men being linotype operators. So he ended up being a porter, which he hated, and unfortunately I never found out about how much he hated what he did until after he died, because my dad hid his anger and his all of the antagonism to the racism that he had to experience, and he hid it by writing. And it was only after he died that my son discovered these notes that my dad had made, referring to the horrible life that he had to live. He was a very intelligent man. As a matter of fact, he ended up as what they call the towerman for the New York City subway system, which is about the highest job you can get before you own it. Of course, nobody owns the New York City subway system. But anyhow, he had managed to merge to the highest job you can get. And I just want to add here, which has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about, but I have to add that people hate the government, and yet my dad and all of his friends, all the young black guys that he knew, all got their jobs through government jobs. If it were not for the government, they would never have emerged because the government didn't discriminate. All you had to do was take an exam, and if you passed the exam, you got the job. So I hear people today saying, "Oh, we don't want government in our lives," yet they don't know. They haven't had the experience of knowing that it's through government jobs that the minority people have been able to succeed. Anyhow, back to my parents and me. So my mother worked as a domestic worker, which she hated, and she said, and everybody that knows me have heard me say that she said to me, "No way are you going to clean white people's floors. You're going to do something respectable." And she sat me down at the piano, because she was a piano teacher, and she sat me down at the piano and gave me lessons. I always tell everybody that she was very lucky because, the story is that when a parent is too strict with a child and insists that they learn, that the child usually rebels. But somehow I didn't rebel, at least not in this area. I rebelled in something else. But I didn't rebel because, as she observed, I loved the music, and I was very good at it. I can even remember in the early days when I was about 6, 7, or whatever, whatever music I heard on the radio, I could sit down and play it at the piano, even though I don't have absolute pitch. What I have, and I still have to this day, is outstanding musical memory. And anything I hear once, I can I can duplicate, which is a big help when you're playing in an orchestra because you've got all this music to play, and especially as a timpanist, you have many measures to count when you don't play. But if you memorize the music, then you don't have to worry about counting. You know it. After you hear it once, you get to know when the flutes come in, when the clarinets come in, that kind of thing. And that's what I've done. And to this day, if I've been retired now for 10 years, and yet if I hear Mahler's first, I can still hear all the individual instruments as though I was still playing it. So anyhow, this is the ability I had when I was growing up, which my mother observed, but of course she made me practice, and she also made me study. You see, my parents, coming from the Caribbean, did not experience, even though they experienced racism here, they didn't experience the same kind of racism that the average African American experienced. In the Caribbean, if you were smart and you did your work, you did very well. And of course, education was really very, very instrumental in most Caribbean countries. Education is the one thing they say will get you out of slavery. So they realized how important education was. So between making me practice and making me study, I ended up going to one of the best schools in New York. And that school was Music and Art High School, which at the time I went to it, I was at Music and Art from 1942 until 1945. 1942, the school was on 135th Street on Convent Avenue, right next to City College. And I got into that school only because my mother made me study. So what's very ironic about this is that I went to what was considered the worst junior high school in New York City. That was Junior High School 136. It was located on 135th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue. It was an all-black school, all black girls, and white teachers. Well, these white teachers were not too interested in us, and that was reflected by the fact that they often said, when there was any disciplinary problems, well, you all will amount to nothing but maids anyhow, so why should I worry about whether you're behaving or misbehaving? Why should I worry if you learn anything? You're not going to amount to anything anyhow. Well, that was what I heard from my teachers. But then when I went home, I heard a different story. You're going to do better. And they made me learn what little I learned in school, to such a point that when I left junior high school 136, I was like a 99% student. But a 99% student in junior high school 136 was nowhere near which would be a 99 student at Music and Art. And the reason for that I didn't discover until many years later, because when I left 136 thinking I was a bright student and I was very good in my music, I played as they say, I played an outstanding audition on the piano, and I got into Music and Art. When I got there, this 99% student dropped down to below 50. Well, all of the guidance counselors, they kept having me come into the office. What happened to you? Why all of a sudden you dropped? Oh, I gotta stop. Okay, to be continued. I had a rude interruption. So they couldn't understand why I had dropped from a 99% student down to 55. Well, the reason was, when I was in 136, I was learning nothing. I happened to excel in an area where there was nothing to excel at. So when I went to Music and Art High School with all these white students, because at that time I was the only black student in my classes. These white kids who came from the best schools in New York, because you could only go if you were a good student. So you got the good students coming from the best students from the best school. So naturally, it turned out that they were way above, and they had kids in my class who, when they took the Regents exam, if they didn't get a 99, they'd take it over. And boy, I remember when I got to the point where I finally got to the point where I got an 85. I was so happy to get an 85 in my exam that I couldn't understand how a person who got 99 would take it over to get 100. But that was because my parents, when they saw that I was doing so poorly in school, they got a tutor for me, and with the help of the tutor and the help of my mother. My mother was working as a domestic up in the Bronx and Fordham Road, and she was working for a woman who was a teacher. And my mother had to take care of this woman's child and do the cleaning and cooking for them. And so I was in this teacher's environment, and my mother would say to her, can you help Elayne a little bit with the homework? And she said, oh yeah, if she had some time. And she would help me a little bit. And so between that and the tutor, that's how I was able to raise my grades from a 55 up to an 85. So I was very happy, I was happy for where I was, but it left a scar on me, and the scar, which still, in a sense, affects me to this day. But when I first went to music and art, I wouldn't talk in class at all, because I felt uncomfortable with the way I spoke, because I spoke as a black kid from the ghetto, and also my parents being Caribbean or from the West Indies, I had something like a West Indian accent, which didn't even do well with the African American kids from the South, because they used to make fun of us, and they would taunt us. We would call monkey chasers and all other kinds of things, and then I went through lots of other difficulties as I was growing up. I wasn't I don't know if you ever heard the expression, if you're white, then you're right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. And I was very black. I didn't have any evidence of any hanky-panky in my family. So my hair was kinky, my lips were thick, and my hair was short, and I mean everything, and all those things I had to overcome one way or the other. And of course, the end of my story shows I overcame it with my music. So with my music, I was able to rise above all the negativities that I experienced as a growing youngster. So anyhow, I got into Music and Art High School in September 1942, and at that time we all had all of the piano students, the students who had auditioned and got in on piano, had to take a orchestral instrument. Well, when I was told that, my first inclination was to play the violin, and I made that request, and the teachers, I think it was Mr. Russ at the time, said, "Oh no, you can't play the violin. You're too skinny." Oh, what? Yeah, well, I was kind of petite, but they said, "No, you're too skinny. You can't play the violin." So I said, "Oh, well, maybe I would like to play the trombone." "Oh no, you can't play the trombone. You don't have enough lung power." So at that time, Mr. Weiss, who was a teacher, he was the brass teacher, but he also taught percussion on the side. He came around and he handed a pair of drumsticks, took out a pair of drumsticks and said, "Why don't we just give her the drums, because all Negroes have rhythm, so she can play the drums." Well, I didn't object to that, even though I was a little bit disappointed, but I didn't object to it. And the reason I didn't object to it was because I had gone the year before, well, no, actually in 1939, I had gone to Barbados with my mother. And while I was in Barbados, I was subjected to listening to this wonderful Caribbean music and the beat, and I always managed to find myself sitting next to the drummer, and I just love that music. I just love the beat. So that that stuck with me. Also, I was born in Harlem, and in Harlem when I was growing up, it was our tradition every Friday. Part of the church activity was to go to a dance at what was called the Rennie or the Savoy. And every Friday night we'd go and we'd dance. We'd have big parties, and the bands at that time didn't realize were so outstanding. People like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway, heard Billie Holiday. That's who I kind of grew up with. So music not only was came to me from my mother and where I lived, but it was around me. Also, I discovered, my mother told me much later, that I have music in my background on both my mother's side and my father's side, because the way my father actually met my mother, or rather, after they met each other, my mother realized that father, she had studied with my father's father. My father's father, in other words, my grandfather from my father's side, was an eminent choir organist with one of the outstanding churches in Barbados, and he was the organist of the church until he died, and that was who my mother had studied piano with. So you see, I was immersed in music. So I guess it was it was ordained that I'd become a musician. But I had all these obstacles to face. You had to realize that in 1942, when I was at Music and Art, there was I think maybe there was one or two other blacks. I think Huey Campbell, but he didn't follow it. And Elayne, another woman by the name of Elayne, she didn't pursue it. And there were no other blacks in the orchestra, and so in a sense I had no, what people talk about, role models. I had no role models. All I knew was the fact that when I got into Music and Art and I was handed these drums and the drumsticks, and I started playing, I almost completely turned my back on playing the piano, because what I didn't say is that I'm an only child. I have no brothers, no sisters. So the days when I was practicing, I used to practice the piano religiously every day with my mother sitting next to me. And if I made a mistake, she would rap me on my knuckles. I mean, can you imagine a mother doing that today? She'd be arrested. But yeah, that's what she used to do. And another very interesting aspect of this was that when I was in Music and Art, kids used to talk about something I didn't know anything about, talk about absolute pitch, perfect pitch. I didn't know what that meant at all. Well, they spoke about it with such reverence, that these European musicians, they had absolute pitch and perfect pitch, and I didn't know anything about it. And it wasn't until much later that I realized my mother had absolute pitch. And that's why she used to, if I made just one little errant note, she would sing it and say, no, that's not what you're supposed to play. And I just took it for granted. Well, she knows the music. Little did I know that my mother had absolute, very perfect pitch. I don't have, as I said before, I don't have absolute pitch or perfect pitch, but I have musical memory. So anyhow, with all of that, I found that I just loved playing the drums. I was then playing music with many other people, which was so important. I was playing this beautiful music, and not sitting in a room by myself, but with all these 60 people. It was so it's just so incredible. And also, I had really no experience of classical music or symphonic music, because most of the piano music I had played was excerpts of symphonies, but with two or four hands on the piano. And I don't think I had ever really heard a major symphony orchestra until my first year at Music and Art High School. But when I heard it, I was so impressed with the wonderful sound, I mean, it's overwhelming. And but much later, whenever I'm interviewed, people always ask me, well, how come you play? How come you play symphony? How come you don't play jazz like most black people? I said, well, if everybody had the opportunity, as I did, to sit in an orchestra and have 80, or sometimes with Strauss operas, have 100 musicians playing around you, well, it's so enormous and so overwhelming that there's no way you could compare that to playing in a jazz group where you got 4 or 5 guys, and you have one soloist, and the others are all just playing behind, and it's not the same kind of deep sound that you get with a symphony orchestra. And I tell everybody the difference between understanding and loving classical, well, not just classical music, but symphonic music, is because of the sound, which you don't hear with jazz. I love jazz. I'll go hear a jazz concert anytime, but it certainly doesn't replace that the dimension of sound that I get from a symphony orchestra. So anyhow, so here I was at Music and Art, and having being given the percussion, and I started practicing. And I practiced and I practiced and I practiced, and I just loved it. And I practiced, and anybody who knows anything about music and art will know that they had an orchestra for every term. So there was a first term orchestra, a second term orchestra, a third term, all the way up to 8th term. Well, naturally, I started in the first term orchestra, and I made immediate progress. I went from the first term, the third term, the 5th, and then into the 8th term orchestra. So by the time I was in the 6th term or 7th term, I was already playing in the 8th term orchestra, and I had started playing the timpani. I can still remember the first symphonic piece I ever heard was Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and I fell in love with it, and I learned it, and I realized all the tunings. It was just an incredible experience. But the experience, in some ways, separated me from my colleagues and friends in Harlem, because they were not privy to the experiences that I had in Music and Art. So eventually, I found that most of my friends were from Music and Art, and that presented somewhat of a problem, because my mother, although she wasn't a racist or anything, she wasn't accustomed to white folks coming into her house. She would go to clean white people's floors, but no white person ever came to our house. So I remember when one of my classmates, her name was Elayne Robbins, I think she's still alive, and the last I heard she was a pianist in Las Vegas. But she had invited me to her house a couple of times to have dinner. She lived up in the Bronx. And I thought, well, I can invite her to my house. So I said, I'd like to have you come to my house. She said, oh, I'm happy to come. So I told my mother, I said, Mom, I've invited my classmate, Adelaide, to come to the house for dinner. My mother says, no, you can't invite her. You can't invite her here. You can't invite. I said, well, why not? She says, because we're having cuckoo tonight. I said, well, what difference does that make? She said, why can't I have her come in? Well, cuckoo is a national dish of Barbados. They have it in Barbados every Friday. To this day, if you go to Barbados in the Caribbean, you're going to have cuckoo on Fridays. But my mother didn't want to invite anybody to the house because we were having cuckoo. I said to her eventually, but Mom, I go to her house and I have whatever, she was Jewish, so I had matzo balls. I said, if I can have matzo balls at her house, she can have cuckoo at my house. And eventually I had to convince my mother that it was okay to have a white person come and eat our food. So as you see, I've had all kinds of interesting experiences just in the process of becoming a musician. Well, I found out, of course, when I was at Music and Art that there were many little orchestras to play in, and for about a year or so I played in Central Park in the, there was a band, I don't think it still exists, but I played, there was a band that gave concerts every Sunday. I played in that. And then I found out about the All City High School Band and the All City High School Orchestra, And as soon as I found out about it, I went and I registered and I played that along with what I was doing at Music and Art. And I played in the Old City High School band. And then, oh, I know, it was called the Goldman Band in Central Park. I played that. And then there were a lot of other little orchestras which I would go to, and I would go and listen. And I realized I had to learn a lot. So I did everything I could to listen to everybody that was playing any kind of music. And also at that time, there was a place called Lewis Holmes Stadium, which was up on 138th Street and Broadway. And that's where the New York Philharmonic would play during the summer. So I remember sitting in Music and Art, and we could look out on Lewis Holmes Stadium from Music and Art, because at that time Music and Art was still uptown. Now Music and Art is called the School of Performing Arts, and it's down on 68th Street. So, so when I was up there, I would sit in class, and we would see the New York Philharmonic rehearsing, and I could see the timpanist. I didn't know who he was at that time, but I was just really so impressed with it, impressed with the sound. And so I would try and get to the concerts as best as I could, which I did. So I was exposed to, I made it a point to be exposed to that music. Whereas when I would come home, I still, would have to go to the church dances on Friday nights, but I could enjoy that, and I could dance. I could dance all night. I could dance to Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Lucky Millinder, all those wonderful old musicians, and then I could go the next day and listen to Bach, which I was learning, and Brahms and Beethoven. It was just so wonderful. I felt I had just the most extraordinary kind of a life, having to live in these two different cultures. So anyhow, I didn't realize that I made an impact on everybody that saw me, so that by the time I got into the 8th term, there was an announcement made that Duke Ellington was going to provide a 3-year scholarship, full paid, to Juilliard, to the outstanding music school graduating from the 5 boroughs, not just New York. So my mother heard about it, and when my mother heard about it, she said, "Lady, did you hear that Duke Ellington is going to give a scholarship to go to Juilliard?" Well, at that point, I had no intentions of becoming a professional musician, because they had already made it clear to me that there were no blacks, no women, and certainly no women playing the drums or the timpani. So that wasn't in my future. I thought I would graduate from high school. I would maybe go to Hunter and become a math teacher, because I loved math. I was very good in math. I did very well. So my mom said, you're going to try out. My first reaction was, I'm going to try out with all those white kids that take special lessons, all those violinists. I'm only playing drums here. She says, no, you're going to go, you're going to go, you're going to go. So she literally forced me to take this exam, take the audition. And I took the audition on the piano, and I still can remember playing, I played Fairy Elise, and, oh gosh, the other one, I forget now. But I played those two, and they said I played it so beautifully, that, and then I'd play some excerpts on the timpani, and unbeknownst to me, I got the scholarship. There were 3 of us that got the scholarship. It was myself on piano and timpani, and a French horn player, Paul Rudolph, who conducted eventually in Levittown, conducted an orchestra in Levittown, but he was a French horn player, and Ross Norwood, who was a flutist. And he never made it to a major symphony, but I think he taught and he played in the local orchestras. Then the following year, 3 more students were chosen. There were 6 altogether that Duke Ellington had chosen to get this prestigious 3-year, fully paid scholarship to Juilliard. Well, the thing that was very outstanding with that was outstanding to most everybody was the fact that I was the only black, the only woman to have, of the 6 that got the scholarship. Also, I was the only one that eventually made it into a major symphony orchestra. So, at the time, of course, nobody ever thought that I would, that I'd even pursue it, because it certainly wasn't anything that you saw any other blacks and women and whatever. But through that scholarship, I got to go to Juilliard, and once I got to Juilliard, I completely abandoned the piano. I can probably play a scale now, but that's about all. But I immersed myself in the timpani. I played, I played in just about everything that you can imagine, every kind of orchestra that was formed outside of Juilliard. The only setback I had was a direct result of my experiences in junior high school. When it came time to choose my subjects at Juilliard, I took no academic subjects whatsoever, because I was still convinced that I was stupid. I knew I was good in music, but I didn't think I could ever possibly make it academically. And I'm sorry, I regret it now, because I would have gotten a degree when I graduated. Oh, as a matter of fact, when I graduated Juilliard after 3 years, they gave me an extra scholarship, so I had an extra year at Juilliard. So I was there for 4 years, and I ended up with a postgraduate diploma. But had I taken some courses, which many of my colleagues did, had I taken some courses at Columbia, I would have had a degree, a BS or something, and I probably would have gone on, because I still continued with the music, but with no academics, because I was really fearful of feeling I just wasn't capable. And that's what racism does to those of us. People think, well, you made it, you're a success, but these things, the impression that you're given as a kid is lingering, and it sticks with you. Even to this day, there's some things I won't do, or some things I won't say, because I feel it's going to expose the fact that maybe I'm not as bright as the other, even though I think I can stand my ground with anyone. But anyhow, I did study at Juilliard, and was very active politically. This is about my percussion experiences, so I won't even bother to tell you about my political experiences, except to say that I've played for the convention of Henry Wallace in 1948. We had a student in the class at that time, cellist, and his name was Vic Sazer. And Vic Sazer had organized an orchestra and got all of those of us that he thought were the outstanding performers, players in the orchestra, and he formed this orchestra, and this is the orchestra that played for Henry Wallace's convention. It was in Philadelphia, and this was in 1948. So then also when I was at Juilliard during that period, there was a Caribbean African-American man by the name of Dean Dixon, who formed an orchestra, and that was called the Americans, no, what did he call it now? The American Youth Orchestra. And this was also a wonderful experience for me, and to have this black man who had a very tragic life, because he wanted to succeed, as a conductor, and he came up against all kinds of barriers, and which was really very, very unfortunate. But I learned a lot from him. So I played in his orchestra, and all along I was taking lessons from Saul Goodman. I started taking lessons from Saul Goodman the year I got the scholarship to Juilliard in 1945. So that summer I went to the summer school at Juilliard, and I felt that I wanted to learn a little bit more. So I had this feeling that I felt very insecure going to Juilliard, So I took a summer course at Juilliard, and that's where I met Saul Goodman. And I have to admit, he just raved about what I was doing, because I only learned what little there was in music and art, And in music and art, it was the trumpet teacher that was teaching us. He wasn't really a drummer; he was a trumpet teacher. So I just read a lot, and I read the books and everything. And so when I got to Juilliard, to the summer school. This was the summer of 1945. There I was. I had to live and scared. There were well, at that time I think I was his only student, because I don't think any of the other kids came to summer school. So I was his only student, and I played in the orchestra with what was his name? Maybe he'll come back to me later. Played in the orchestra, and I got to meet the famous Mo Goldenberg. And I can remember even then, I hadn't actually started my time at Juilliard. I was just in the summer department. And he was already telling Mo, what a great player I was, and how I caught on to it so quickly. And I attribute that to the fact that I was a good pianist, so it was just a question of making the transition from the treble clef to the bass clef. So I had no problems reading anything, and I used to practice the Goodman method using a pencil everywhere. I mean, I don't think there was a moment that I wasn't using the pencil to get that particular style that Goodman used in playing. So I worked at that, and the last concert that we gave, that I played in before I graduated Juilliard, Fritz Reiner happened to conduct. And it was, I'll never forget this either, it was Brahms' First Symphony. Well, there were all these guys in the percussion section, and I don't feel like going through the fact of how they treated me. They made fun of me all the time, and they were super critical of anything I did. And I guess having been a kind of a person where I grew up in Harlem, and I never felt comfortable even in Harlem. I never felt comfortable with blacks because I was always too black. And I was always like the outsider, so I was accustomed to people not liking me or criticizing me or whatever. So so they made fun of me, and the more they made fun of me, the more determined I became to be the best. So at the end of as I said, the year I was graduating, it was in 1949, we were playing Brahms' First Symphony, and Fritz Reiner was conducting. I think it was John Paul Morell. I forget who the director of the. It was either gosh, I can't remember his name. Well, anyhow, they had to select who would be the players in the orchestra for Reiner, and I was chosen. And when I was chosen to play, all the guys walked out. They said they weren't going to play second to. Well, of course, there was no percussion of significance in Brahms' First, but they didn't want to be there because I was chosen to play. Well, you know what? I didn't let that bother me. I played, and I played as well. I fell in love with Brahms' First. It's just the most wonderful timpani part. And I played it, and I followed the Fritz Reiner that everybody was so afraid of. And at the end of the concert, the concert is over. We all bow and I go back. And as I'm leaving, as I finish packing up the timpani and walking out, somebody says, "Hey, Elayne, the maestro wants to see you." Well, I was scared to death. I thought, "Oh my God, I bet he's going to criticize me. And I was almost in tears. I didn't want to go. He said, "The maestro wants to see you. The maestro wants to see you." Well, I gathered myself together and I walked into his room expecting the worst. He was talking to somebody, and as he saw me, he says, come, young lady. And I walked in, and he says, "Young lady, you are so fine. You are such a fine musician." Well, well, I don't have to tell you. I felt as though I dropped dead at the moment. I was so exhilarated when I walked out. I guess I was walking on the 10th. I wasn't walking on 9th heaven or 7th heaven. I was walking on 10th heaven to get that kind of compliment from the great Fritz Reiner. So that was my last bout with Juilliard. Well, the same year that I graduated, which I said was I graduated. This was the second my my second graduation, because I had the first graduation after 3 years. Then I had another graduation because they had extended my scholarship. So after 1949, all during this period, I used to go to Carnegie Hall, and I'd go by myself. I would sneak in, and I'd go and I'd listen to the orchestras. So I used to listen to the Boston Symphony because they came quite frequently to Carnegie Hall. And I heard them play, and I watched the timpanists. I always watched every other timpanist to see what they did and how they played. And so just about that time, there was an announcement that they were holding auditions for students to go to Tanglewood. What the hell was Tanglewood? I never heard of Tanglewood. So I kind of asked around, what is Tanglewood? He said, well, that's where the Boston Symphony plays in the summer. Oh, really? And what's the point of that? Well, you go and you get coached by the Boston Symphony members, and you spend the whole summer bask in music. Well, it sounded exciting to me. I had never really done anything like that for the summer, and the summers were always difficult for me because being an only child, my mother never let me go to camp. I couldn't go. The only place I would go would be with her. She always used to say she had all her eggs in one basket. So I never went anywhere alone, even to the movies. I think it wasn't until I was about 16 or so that I went to a movie by myself. All the other times she would arrange and we would go together. So here was this opportunity for me to go to Tanglewood, to spend the whole summer away from my mother and my father. But I thought, gee, this sounds like a really great experience. So I tried out, and I auditioned with a whole bunch of other timpani players, and not only was I accepted, but I got a scholarship. So I spent the entire summer, the best summer of my life, and I say that without any qualifications, reservations whatsoever. It was the best summer of my life to spend with these musicians. At that time, Leonard Bernstein was there. He was 29. He was a young, gorgeous man. Everybody loved Leonard Bernstein. And Aaron Copland was there. And, oh gosh, I can't think now the rest of the other people who were there. But we had a intense time of learning about the opera, symphony, and chamber music. All this I was exposed to. It was just so fascinating. So I was up there, and again, I was the only black person in the orchestra, and of course I was the only woman at that time in the percussion section. There were a few women in the other parts of the orchestra, but I was the only black. And I had to contend with these guys who didn't like having me around. Fortunately, Roman Schultz, who was a timpanist, he was a very observant guy, and I guess he must have observed that the fellows were trying to give me a hard time. So he would try to rotate when we would play the timpani, so that they wouldn't feel that he was preferring me and giving me special attention or whatever. Because it was a time when, much later, when some of these same guys said that the only reason I was a success was because Goodman gave me more attention, because he never thought I would be a competitor. He figured, well, it didn't matter what he did. He could teach me, but he wouldn't teach the men because he was afraid the men would eventually supplant him. Well, that was what I was told. And it came to be much later in my career when I was playing with the New York City Opera in Chicago. And that year I met Ted Bradshaw, who was the timpanist of the London Symphony at the time. No, the Royal Philharmonic. And I met him when I was in Chicago because that orchestra was playing the same time I was there with the New York City Opera. Well, we got to know each other, and he said that the orchestra was going to be in New York at Carnegie. So I said, well, when you come, we'll all get together, and I'll get you together with Saul Goodman. He said, oh, I would love that very much. So that was what I arranged. So I came back to New York, of course, with the opera company, and about a month or two later, the Royal Philharmonic was in New York, And I went and I had a chance to go up and speak to Mr. Bradshaw. And I said, is it okay if I try and get hold of Saul Goodman and we can all have lunch together? He says, oh, by all means, yes, yes, yes. So I called Saul and I told him what the situation was, and he said, oh, he'd be happy to go and meet Mr. Bradshaw. It just so happened that when they came to town, he was busy and didn't have a chance to hear them. But if I could arrange it, it would be fine. So to make a long story short, we had lunch. Well, you know what Saul Goodman did? We walked in. As he walked in, he saw me and he said to me, "Do you know you took a job of mine? You took a job of mine." And Mr. Bradshaw is standing there. I'm looking at him and I'm saying, "I didn't understand what you're talking about." He says, "You took my job." Well, what had happened was that by this time I was playing with the New York City Opera, and I was also doing some recordings with the New York City Opera with Leopold Stokowski conducting. And there was a time when Joe Fabroni, who was the contractor, was hiring the orchestra, and he hired everybody. He hired me, and I played a recording with Leopold Stokowski, and he was so pleased with what I was doing that he asked, could I play the next recording? Well, that's what Saul Goodman was talking about. Saul Goodman was upset because Stokowski had asked me to do this recording, and Saul Goodman, of course, assumed that he would be the one that would be playing, not me. So that's why he was angry with me when he approached me. He approached me. "You took a job away from me." Well, I was stunned, and of course, Mr. Bradshaw, being the Englishman he is, he was very tactful, and he says, "Oh, there's nothing about it. Let's have lunch, So we had our lunch, and then Saul had to go off. He had some students or whatever. So in the meantime, Mr. Bradshaw and I, we parted. But before he parted, he said to me, "I don't understand why he should behave. I'd be so proud if my student could take a job of mine." Well, that stuck in my mind, and I've always remembered that what my colleagues in school had been said that Saul was afraid of. It seems as though that's what actually happened. That I did take a job which Saul didn't expect to have happen. So that was my experience with my last year at Juilliard, where I got the after I graduated and I auditioned for Tanglewood, I got the position with the Tanglewood Orchestra. Stayed there for the whole summer, and then played the final concert, which Roman Schultz chose me, and that was Beethoven's Ninth, with the Tanglewood chorus and orchestra. It was quite a gala concert. It was even taped, and it was taped, and I found out that it was taped because several months later, that became a highlight because I was playing in the orchestra. It was the first time they saw a black person playing in the orchestra. So they did a little interview to ask me, how did I happen to be there. So I told them the same story that I told you, that I had auditioned and got the scholarship and spent that wonderful summer. Well, my good fortune continued. The end of the summer, the end of my stay at Tanglewood, as soon as I got back home, I heard that there was an audition for the New York City Opera. Well, again, my mother said, "I heard somebody told me, or heard somebody I hope I heard somebody saying that there's an opening of the New York City Opera. You're going to audition, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't know if I could audition." She said, "Well, you better go and audition." So I called and I made the appointment to come in and audition, which I did. I went and I auditioned, and after a day or so, I got called and I was told that I was accepted. I got the job. I was flabbergasted. Imagine, this would be my first big major professional job, playing timpani with the New York City Opera. But actually, I had played with, prior to that, I had played with what was known as the National Orchestral Association. I played with them for about 3-4 years. That was while I was at Juilliard. I also played with the NOA. The person who was the head of the NOA, the great conductor and teacher, was a man by the name of Leon Barzan. And Leon Barzan was also the conductor of the then forming New York City Ballet Company. So as a result of playing with the National Orchestral Association, which was the NOA, which was it was called it wasn't a professional orchestra, it was an orchestra designed to teach musicians, all the classical symphonic repertoire, which I played. As I said, I was there for about 3 or 4 years, and Barzan liked me, and he got me to play with the New York City Ballet when it was called the New York City. No, it's called New York. It was called Ballet Society, and we played on Monday and Tuesday at the City Center, and the rest of the week was the New York City Opera. But at that time, this was like 1948. I played with them when the other guy couldn't show up. So I had some experience there. Plus, I had some experience playing opera because we had an opera orchestra at Juilliard, and during that time, I had the opportunity to play with Igor Stravinsky live. I played, which I didn't know anything about, the Oedipus Rex. I played Oedipus Rex at Juilliard with Igor Stravinsky conducting. So anyhow, with that behind me, I auditioned for the New York City Opera and got the job. So when I got the job, the management didn't want to take me. They said, well, they didn't know because they didn't know if I would fit in because I wasn't white, I wasn't Italian, I wasn't a male, and whoever heard of a woman playing timpani? So at that time, even though, this is before Goodman and I had that confrontation with Bradshaw. This was in September of 1949, and the incident with Bradshaw would have been like 1952. So Goodman said to the manager of the New York City Opera, well, she's the best person. If she auditions, she's entitled to the job. He said, but she's not even Italian. She doesn't know. He says, well, I can't recommend anybody. If she's won the job, she's entitled to the job. So at that time, Al Howard was playing the timpani, and he was scheduled to leave, but he didn't leave. He didn't leave as the season began. He stayed during the period of rehearsals. So what I would do, I would go every day to the rehearsals, and I would sit and I would watch what he's doing and listen to the music and listen to the repertoire. So by the time Al left, I was handed the Rosenkavalier to play without having rehearsed with the orchestra. Well, I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever been as frightened as I was at that particular time to play Rosenkavalier with an opera that with tunings almost every measure, and with a conductor that conducted like I don't know, like Satan. His name was Joseph Rosenstock. What a guy he was, and the way he conducted that opera was certainly something else. And so I had to play Rosenkavalier, and anybody that knows anything, if you just hear the music, you know it's difficult music, and I had to play that without a rehearsal. And I always had a speculation that they figured that if I had to play that opera without a rehearsal, I would just make such a mess of it that then they could say, oh, see, she didn't do a good job. But if anything, at the end, I'll never forget that Dave and Bob, Dave who was our principal trombone player, and Ted, who was our principal trumpet player, and the percussion player, I just forgot his name. They all turned around and they said, wow, what a job you did on that, considering that you never played it before, and considering they just gave me all kinds of accolades about it. And it was difficult. And I had to learn how to listen to the stage, also read the cues on my part, and tune at the same time. It was quite a thing, and I think that's what really solidified my professional life. So, oops, let me take the. Okay, here I had the job with the New York City Opera, and it was very unusual as I look back on it because they didn't want me because I was black. They didn't want me because I wasn't Italian. They didn't want me because I was a girl playing a male instrument. So, but with Goodman's help, over recommendation, because he said at the time that I was the best person for the job, so they took me. But they took me with the understanding, I think I wasn't aware of this, that they would make it very difficult for me. So what happened was Al Brown was the timpanist, and he had gotten a different job and was leaving the New York City Opera. So instead of leaving in September, he put off his departure until almost the middle of October. And when I made my debut, I played Rosenkavalier, one of the most difficult timpani parts in the repertoire, the opera of Rosenkavalier, without a rehearsal. And what I had was just to observe over his shoulder, because I would go to all the rehearsals, and I went to the first couple of performances. So that was how I had to learn the part. Fortunately, as it turned out, as I had said, I have really very good musical memory, and a lot of what I heard I absorbed and was able to utilize it when I played my first performance. Well, you know, at this point I'm thinking, let me go back and figure out why was I able to do this under such stress, under all the firsts that I had to deal with. So I kind of backed up on my life. Now, I had said that when I went to Music and Art High School, I was given the drums because the teacher had said that all black people have rhythm, so give her the drums. Whereas I had wanted the violin, and they said I was too skinny. But I really liked the drums because in 1939 I had gone with my mother to visit her island, her home island, her birthplace in Barbados, and I was 11, and I went with her, and I spent most of my time sitting and listening to the bands. I loved their rhythm. It was so different from what I had grown up with in Harlem, whereas I heard Duke Ellington, Count Basie, you name it, all the top band leaders who at that time were just considered, they played for the dancing, and that's all we were concerned about. But much later in my life, I realized that I was in the company of the greats. So anyhow, I had grown up listening to all the great jazz band, swing bands as we called it in those days, swing band. They don't call that anymore. And then I went to Barbados and I listened to calypso, different beat. Well, I found that I really picked up the beat. I was able to understand the beat, and at that time, because I loved to dance, so I found that I was dancing a different rhythm to the beat of the calypso than to the beat of the swing band, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and the calypso was 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1, 2, and 3, 4. But that's the basic rhythm. So when I was given the percussion, it was almost like, well, maybe this is what I want to do. But I had forgotten that preceding that, right after I came back from Barbados with my mother, came back in September in time for the opening of school, the beginning of September. Not too long after that, in the community that I lived in, was the first housing development. It was called the Harlem River Houses, and it was the first housing development. And it was the first time they actually had activities which was directed to the children, to get the children off the streets. So, unbeknownst to me, which I found out later, of course, there was this young man, his name was George Brown, we used to call him Brownie. He decided to form a a drum and bugle corps. Now, in those days in Harlem, every time there was any kind of event, whether it was a birth, a killing, or I can remember when we all gathered and had a big parade when Joe Louis beat Max Schmeling, and the famous German boxer. There was all these parades. There was always a parade going up and down 7th Avenue between 110th Street and up to 155th Street. So there were these bands, and at that time they had this group called the 369th Army Regiment. These were equivalent to the armed forces, or to the not the armed forces, the group that they have that that takes care of, I forget the name of it. But anyhow, they had the 369th was very, very famous. And Brownie had decided that when they were marching, it would be nice if they had a band. So he started to build up this band, which was called the 369th Marching Band. And he put out a call for musicians. Now, he himself was a drummer, and as I look back on it, he was a really fine drummer. At that time, I didn't know the difference. But anyhow, he put out a call, and somehow somebody said to me, "Hey, Elayne, why don't you go join the drum corps?" Well, I had no real interest in joining a drum corps, but I went along because some of my other friends were in the drum corps, so I went. And that's where I met Brownie. And what he did, he gathered us, there were about 10 of us, and he gathered all of us together and said he's going to form this drum and bugle corps, and we were going to be the drummers. Wow, great. So my first experience was he brought in drumsticks. We had no drums at that time, we just had drumsticks, and he showed us how to hold the drumsticks. So the only thing that we had to play on were the tables. So he taught us first how to hold these sticks, between the thumb and first finger, and between the third and the fourth finger, the way that's not played, because nowadays they use the match grip. But at that time, that was the way we held our sticks. And so he taught us how to manipulate hitting the sticks on the table, and little by little we would hit the sticks we would hit on the table 1 and 2 and then later on you had 1 and 2 and then after that he introduced the what was called the Mama Daddy roll, and that was 1 and 2 and 3, left, right, left, right, and he had us practice that for quite a while until we got faster and faster, and eventually